He was thrown out at 18. Years later, his dog uncovered a secret powerful men tried to bury forever. Kicked out. At 18, a Navy SEAL bought a $1 stone cottage. His dog found what no one was meant to see. The night they locked him out, he had nothing but a duffel bag and a promise to himself. 10 years later, battle-scarred and carrying more ghosts than gear, he bought a forgotten stone cottage deep in the Smoky Mountains for $1. He thought he was buying silence. Instead, his loyal K9 uncovered something buried beneath the hearth, something that would shake an entire town. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The first thing Ethan Cole saw was his duffel bag. It sat upright on the front porch like it had been placed there carefully, not thrown. The zipper was closed. The shoulder strap was neatly folded over the top. Beside it lay a pair of his boots, laces tied together and looped over the handle. The porch light was on, even though it was still daylight. Ethan stood in the driveway for a long moment, the late afternoon sun dipping low behind the maples that lined the narrow suburban street. The house in front of him was the only home he had known since he was 12. A beige two-story with white shutters and a lawn his stepfather trimmed with military precision every Saturday morning. The front door was closed. That wasn't unusual. The silence behind it was. He walked up the steps slowly, the boards creaking under his weight. He had just come back from a JROTC field exercise at school. His t-shirt was damp with sweat, and there was dirt under his fingernails. He had felt proud walking home, imagining telling his mother about how he'd been chosen to lead a squad drill. He reached for the door. It didn't budge. He tried again. Locked. He knocked once, then harder. "Mom?" Nothing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his stepfather. "You want to be a soldier so bad? Grow up somewhere else." Ethan read it twice before his eyes shifted to the piece of paper taped to the inside of the storm door. He hadn't noticed it at first. He leaned closer. "Ethan, we can't support this decision. If you insist on throwing your life away, chasing some war fantasy, you'll have to do it on your own. There's some cash in the side pocket of your bag. Take it and go cool off. When you're ready to be serious about your future, you can call." Marco's signature from his mother. No handwriting he recognized as hers. Just that steady printed block lettering. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked 2 houses down. A lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across the street. Ethan felt heat rising in his chest, but it wasn't the loud kind of anger. It was something tighter, colder, like a door closing somewhere deep inside him. He bent down and unzipped the side pocket of his duffel. $200 in 20s. Folded once. That was it. No suitcase. No box of childhood things. No explanation. He knocked again. Harder this time. "Mom!" His voice cracked on the second syllable. The curtains in the front window shifted slightly. Just enough for him to see movement. She was inside. She wasn't coming to the door. Ethan stepped back off the porch slowly. His breathing felt strange, shallow. He looked around at the street, the basketball hoop at the end of the driveway, the oak tree he had climbed when he was 13, the dent in the garage door from when he had backed the mower into it by accident. Every memory still stood exactly where it had always been. Only he didn't belong to it anymore. He picked up the duffel. The zipper rattled softly. The porch light flicked off. That was when it hit him. Not like a punch, not like a shout. Just a simple understanding. He had already been replaced. He walked down the driveway without looking back again. His truck was parked at the curb. A rusted Ford Ranger he'd bought with summer landscaping money. The passenger door squeaked when he opened it. He tossed the duffel onto the bench seat and climbed in behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there. The sky above the rooftops was turning orange. The air smelled like cut grass and gasoline. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faintly and faded. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel. He wasn't crying. He wasn't yelling. He was memorizing the feeling, the exact shape of it, the exact temperature. Because he knew something, even at 18. If he survived this moment, he would never let anyone put him here again. He started the truck. The engine coughed before catching. He drove without a plan, just out of the subdivision, past the elementary school, past the gas station where he used to buy candy after baseball practice. By the time darkness fell, he had parked behind an abandoned strip mall 15 miles away. The parking lot lights flickered inconsistently. Crickets chirped in the weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. He reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go. The metal roof of the truck ticked softly as it cooled. He stared at it for hours. Every now and then, headlights passed on the highway nearby, briefly washing the inside of the cab in white light before disappearing again. He imagined knocking on the door tomorrow and pretending this was all a misunderstanding. He imagined his mother opening it, arms outstretched. But he knew better. He reached into the duffel and pulled out a folded recruitment pamphlet he had hidden there weeks earlier. United States Navy. He smoothed it out across his chest. The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust. "I won't need anyone," he whispered into the dark truck cab. The words felt strange, like something he was carving into stone. "I'll be strong enough." The night deepened. The air grew colder. His stomach growled quietly. He didn't sleep much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the porch light flicking off. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the metal roof. Ethan lay there, listening to it, the rhythm constant and indifferent. He realized something else as he stared at the ceiling. It wasn't just that he'd been kicked out. It was that the house had chosen silence over him. And that kind of silence doesn't come undone easily. He rolled onto his side, facing the passenger seat where the duffel lay. $200, a truck that barely ran, and nothing else. The rain kept falling. Ethan closed his eyes and made one final promise to himself. One day, he would build a place no one could lock him out of, and no one would ever make him feel like he didn't belong again. 10 years later, Ethan Cole stood at the edge of a runway in Virginia, the wind whipping across the tarmac as a military transport plane roared overhead. He was 29 now, broader in the shoulders, leaner in the face. The softness of 18 had burned away somewhere between boot camp and his third deployment. The boy who had slept in a truck behind a strip mall had been forged into something harder. The uniform fit him like it had grown from his skin. Decorations lined his chest in quiet rows. No flash, no bragging, just metal and ribbon marking places most people would never see. The ceremony had been short. A handshake, a few words from a commanding officer. Medical retirement. The phrase sounded clinical, detached, as if the war had simply checked a box and moved on. But Ethan knew better. War didn't move on. It followed. He felt it now as the transport plane disappeared into the clouds, the tightening in his chest, the reflex that made his eyes scan rooftops and distant tree lines automatically, even on a base, even surrounded by people in the same uniform. The loud crack of a toolbox dropped somewhere nearby made his jaw clench before he could stop it. He forced his breathing slow. Inhale. Exhale. A familiar presence pressed gently against his left leg. Atlas. The Belgian Malinois sat tall and still, ears forward, eyes alert but calm. A patch of graying fur had begun to appear along his muzzle, but his body remained coiled with controlled power. Atlas didn't look at the sky. He looked at Ethan. Always at Ethan. The bond between them hadn't been born in comfort. It had been forged in dust and smoke and chaos thousands of miles away. Ethan still remembered the heat of that night in Syria. The compound had been quiet at first. Too quiet. Intel had said weapons cache, minimal resistance. But as soon as they breached the outer wall, the air split apart in noise and fire. Ethan had moved through the hallway with Atlas at his side, every sense narrowed to the smallest flicker of motion. Atlas had paused at a doorway, stiffened, then lunged before Ethan could see what he had already smelled. An explosive device had been wired to the doorframe. Atlas had pulled Ethan backward just as the detonation ripped through the corridor. The blast threw Ethan against concrete. For a few seconds, there had been no sound, just white light and dust. When his hearing returned, it came as a ringing scream inside his skull. He remembered trying to move and feeling nothing below his waist. Then weight, warmth. Atlas had crawled across broken debris and pressed his body against Ethan's chest, nudging him, whining low, but controlled. Alive. That was the first word Ethan had thought. Alive because of him. The explosion had shattered part of the building and injured 2 men in the unit. One of them never walked again. Ethan had survived with a concussion, torn ligaments, and a scar that curved along his ribcage like a pale crescent moon. But the real damage wasn't carved into flesh. It lived in the quiet moments, like now. A mechanic slammed a hatch shut 50 yards away. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward a weapon that wasn't there anymore. Atlas rose smoothly, positioning himself slightly in front of Ethan without command. Protective. Grounded. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck. "I'm good," he murmured. Atlas held his gaze for a beat longer before easing back into a seated position. They had been discharged together. The military had offered Atlas adoption to Ethan without hesitation. There had been no question, no paperwork delay. Some bonds were too obvious to debate. Now, as other service members hugged families and loaded duffel bags into SUVs, Ethan stood alone with a single sea bag and a dog crate. No one waited for him. No one waved. He had received one message from his mother the day the retirement paperwork processed. He hadn't opened it. Instead of going back to the suburban street where the porch light had once clicked off behind him, Ethan drove west. Atlas lay in the passenger seat, head resting on the edge of the console, eyes scanning the road with quiet vigilance. They crossed state lines as the landscape shifted from coastal flatlands to rolling hills, then to mountains rising like dark guardians against the sky. The Smokies appeared in layers of blue-gray mist. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was memory. One day he had promised himself he would build a place no one could lock him out of. He hadn't known what that meant at 18. Now he did. Not a mansion. Not a fortress. Just ground that answered to him. A place quiet enough to let the noise inside his head settle. They pulled off a highway onto a narrow road that wound upward into thicker forest. The trees grew taller. The houses disappeared. The signal bars on his phone dropped to 1, then none. Atlas lifted his head slightly as the tires rolled over gravel. The world felt farther away here. Ethan didn't know yet about the cottage, didn't know about the hearthstone or the secrets buried beneath it. All he knew was this. The war had built him into something strong enough to survive being abandoned. But it had also hollowed out pieces of him he wasn't sure how to refill. As twilight deepened over the mountains, Ethan slowed the truck at an overlook. He stepped out, boots crunching against gravel. The valley below was wrapped in fog. A river cut silver through the trees. The air smelled clean, pine, damp earth, cold stone. Atlas stood beside him, shoulder brushing his thigh. For the first time in years, there were no gunshots in the distance, no radio chatter in his ear, no commands. Just wind moving across the mountains. Ethan exhaled slowly. The boy who had slept in a truck had become a warrior, but the warrior was tired. He looked down at Atlas. "Let's find somewhere that's ours," he said quietly. Atlas's tail gave one firm, deliberate wag. The mountains did not answer, but they did not turn him away either. Ethan stood at the overlook until the last light drained from the sky. The fog thickened in the valley below, folding into itself like something breathing slowly in its sleep. Atlas leaned lightly against his leg, steady and present. There was no applause for surviving war, no parade for coming home with invisible fractures in the mind. Just paperwork, a final salute, and a highway stretching west. Ethan climbed back into the truck and drove deeper into the Smokies. The next morning, he found himself parked outside a small county administration building in a town called Black Hollow. It wasn't much more than a crossroads, one gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a feed store, and a 2-story brick courthouse that looked older than most of the trees around it. The town felt quiet in a different way than the mountains. Not empty, just observant. Atlas stepped out of the truck first, scanning the parking lot before sitting beside the driver's door. A few locals glanced at them. The dog's posture alone told a story. Disciplined, focused, not a pet you let run loose. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Behind a wooden counter stood a woman in her late 30s with chestnut hair pulled into a low bun. She wore a denim shirt and reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. A small nameplate read, Clara Bennett. She looked up when the door opened. Her eyes lingered briefly on Atlas before settling on Ethan. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice calm but cautious. "I'm looking into rural preservation properties," Ethan said. "Heard there was an abandoned one up in the hills." Clara's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Which one?" "The Stone Cottage, off Bear Ridge Trail." She closed the file folder she'd been holding and folded her hands over it. "That one's not exactly move-in ready." "I'm not looking for ready." There was a long pause. Clara turned and retrieved a thin folder from a cabinet behind her. She slid it across the counter. The listing was brief. 1880s stone cottage, 2 acres, no active utilities, access road washed out. Buyer must restore and reside on property within 5 years. Sale price $1. Ethan stared at the final line. $1? He asked. "County ordinance," Clara replied. "We can't demolish it because it's historically protected. No one's wanted it in decades. Too remote. Too much work." "Why hasn't it collapsed?" "Stone walls are thick, built before shortcuts." She hesitated. "It also has a history." Ethan met her gaze. "What kind?" Clara tapped the file gently. "Disappearance. 1944. A man named Henry Dawson. Lived there alone during the war. Vanished. No body found. Sheriff's office closed the case eventually." Atlas shifted slightly at Ethan's side, ears tilting forward. "Folks around here say the place never felt right after that," Clara continued. "People tried fixing it up once in the 70s. Left within a month." "Why?" She shrugged. "Wouldn't say." Ethan looked down at the paperwork again. Isolation. Silence. Stone walls that didn't move. Something in him recognized the shape of it. "How far from town?" 7 miles. Last mile's barely a road." "No neighbors?" "Closest house is over the ridge. You won't see them unless you go looking." That sounded like mercy. Ethan pulled out his wallet. Clara blinked. "You're serious?" He placed a dollar bill on the counter. "I don't need easy," he said quietly. "I just need mine." Clara studied him for a moment. Really studied him this time. The scars near his collarbone. The way his shoulders never fully relaxed. The dog who never took his eyes off the room. "You're not running from something, are you?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't answer right away. "Just trying to build something that stays," he said at last. Clara slid the paperwork forward. "Then sign here." The pen felt heavier than it should have. When he finished, Clara stamped the form with a firm thud. "It's yours, Mr. Cole," Ethan picked up the folder. Atlas stood immediately, as if he had been waiting for the signal. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. They drove up Bear Ridge Trail in low gear. The gravel gave way to dirt, then to uneven ruts carved by old rainwater. Branches brushed the sides of the truck. After nearly 40 minutes of climbing, the road narrowed into something barely wider than the vehicle. And then, through the trees, stone, gray and solid. The cottage stood half-hidden behind tall grass and skeletal trees. The roof sagged slightly on one side. The chimney leaned but held. Moss crawled across the stone walls like something reclaiming its territory. It wasn't grand. It wasn't welcoming. It was stubborn. Ethan turned off the engine. For a moment, there was only wind moving through branches. Atlas jumped down first, paws crunching softly over gravel. He circled once, nose low, reading the air. Ethan stepped out slowly. The place felt untouched, not peaceful, just waiting. He walked toward the door, an old wooden slab reinforced with rusted iron hinges. He pushed it open gently. The interior was dim but intact. Stone floor, one large hearth dominating the far wall, exposed beams overhead, dust floating in narrow shafts of light from two small windows. Atlas entered ahead of him, paused, head lifted, listening. Ethan stepped fully inside. The temperature dropped slightly. The air carried the faint scent of old soot and damp earth. He ran his hand along the stone wall. Solid, unmoving. The kind of structure that didn't apologize. "This'll do," he murmured. Atlas moved toward the hearth and sat. Not casually, intentionally, watching. Ethan noticed the posture but dismissed it for now. Dogs read places differently. New territory always meant new signals. He set his sea bag down in the center of the room. No electricity, no running water, no neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. It wasn't comfort, but it was his. Ethan stepped back outside and looked at the mountain ridge rising behind the cottage. Sunlight filtered through thinning clouds, casting long shadows over the clearing. For the first time since leaving base, something inside him eased. Not entirely, not fully, but enough. He hadn't built it yet, but no one could lock this door, and no one would tell him to leave. Atlas remained seated by the hearth inside, waiting. He didn't lie down. He didn't wander. He sat with his ears angled forward, eyes fixed on the wide stone fireplace as if it were something breathing quietly in the dark. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. "You find something?" he asked lightly. Atlas did not move. The wind shifted outside, brushing through tall grass and rattling loose slate on the roof. The sound echoed faintly through the chimney. Ethan stepped back inside. The interior felt cooler now that the sun had dipped lower. Dust floated in the last ribbons of light coming through the narrow windows. The hearth dominated the far wall. Massive stones stacked with deliberate weight, blackened from fires long gone cold. It looked older than the war Clara had mentioned. Older than most things. Atlas let out a low breath through his nose. Not a growl, not a whine. A signal. Ethan walked toward him, boots scraping lightly over the uneven stone floor. He crouched and ran a hand along Atlas's back. "You're good," he said. "Just new ground." Atlas's muscles remained tense. Ethan stood and examined the hearth more closely. The iron crane for hanging pots still hung crookedly inside the firebox. Soot coated the inner stones. The mantel above was bare except for spider webs drifting in the corners. Nothing obvious, nothing alive. But the feeling lingered. Not fear. Observation. As if the cottage itself had turned its attention toward them. Outside, tires crunched over gravel. Ethan straightened instantly. Atlas was on his feet before the engine even cut. A pickup truck rolled into view near the clearing's edge. Older model, faded green, county plates. The driver's door opened slowly. Sheriff Roy Mercer stepped out. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered with thinning gray hair and a mustache that had likely been there longer than some of the buildings in Black Hollow. He wore his badge on a tan uniform that looked pressed but worn. He didn't approach immediately. He stood by the truck first, scanning the cottage. Then he walked forward, boots deliberate against the dirt. Ethan stepped out to meet him, Atlas positioned slightly behind his leg, but fully alert. "Afternoon?" the sheriff called, voice steady. "Afternoon? You Ethan Cole?" "That's right." Sheriff Mercer nodded slowly. "Heard someone finally bought this place." Ethan didn't offer more. Sheriff Mercer's eyes flicked briefly to Atlas. "Military dog?" "Yes, sir." "Figures." There was no insult in the tone, just assessment. "You planning to stay up here full-time?" the sheriff asked. "That's the idea." Sheriff Mercer glanced toward the trees lining the ridge. "This mountain's quiet, but it's not empty." Ethan waited. "There's been folks who tried this before," Mercer continued. "Didn't last." "Why not?" The sheriff hesitated. "Some places carry weight," he said finally. "This one's seen things." Ethan studied him carefully. Clara mentioned a disappearance. Mercer's jaw tightened just slightly. "Captain Henry Dawson," he said. "Army intelligence. Lived here alone during the war. Started digging into things that weren't his business. Then one day, he was just gone. No body? None found." Atlas shifted again, stepping half a pace forward. A quiet rumble vibrated in his chest. Sheriff Mercer noticed. "He reacting to something?" "He's cautious," Ethan replied calmly. Mercer looked toward the hearth through the open doorway. "People around here don't like stirring old dirt," the sheriff said. "Town survives on trust, on not tearing at scabs." "I'm not here to dig up anything," Ethan said evenly. "Just want a roof and some quiet." Mercer studied him longer this time. "You a man who leaves things alone, Mr. Cole?" Ethan thought of the porch light clicking off, of the blast in Syria, of Atlas dragging him from fire. "I try to be," he answered. The sheriff nodded once. "Well, if you need anything, town's got a diner open till 8. And if you hear something you can't explain, sometimes it's just the wind." He turned and walked back to his truck. Atlas remained still until the engine faded down the trail. Only then did he relax slightly. Ethan exhaled. The air felt heavier now. Not threatening, just layered. As if the mountain had noticed him and was measuring his presence. The sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long across the clearing. Ethan unloaded a small camping lantern and set it on the stone floor inside. He unrolled a sleeping pad near the far wall, keeping distance from the hearth. Atlas returned to his original position near the fireplace, watching. "Come on," Ethan said gently. "You can lie down." Atlas didn't. He remained upright. The silence thickened as night fell. No streetlights, no distant traffic. Just wind threading through branches and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to cooler air. Ethan lay back on the pad, staring up at the dark beams overhead. Sleep did not come easily. Every shift in sound felt amplified. A twig snapping outside. A rustle in the brush. Once something heavier moving beyond the tree line. Atlas's ears flicked at each one, but he did not bark. Just watched. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting pale light through the window and across the hearthstones. Around midnight, Ethan's eyes finally began to close. Then, a faint scrape. Not outside. Inside. Atlas was already on his feet. Ethan sat up instantly. The scrape came again. Subtle, like stone shifting against stone. He reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam swept across the room. Nothing moved. Nothing fell. The hearth stood as it had. Atlas stepped closer to it, nose hovering inches from the lower stones. Ethan rose slowly and approached. "What is it?" he whispered. Atlas lowered his head and pawed lightly at the edge of the hearthstone. Just once. Then he looked back at Ethan. The air inside the cottage felt colder suddenly. Not wind, not draft, just a quiet shift. Ethan crouched beside the hearth, running his fingers along the seam between the large stone slab and the surrounding floor. It felt uneven, intentional. But he pulled his hand back. "Tomorrow," he murmured. Atlas held his gaze for a moment longer before easing back into position. Ethan lay down again, but sleep did not return. Outside, the mountain stood still. Inside, the hearth kept its silence. The mountain was watching, and something beneath the stone was waiting. Dawn came pale and thin through the cottage windows, a gray wash over rough stone walls. Ethan had barely slept. Every time he drifted off, his mind replayed the faint scrape he had heard near the hearth. Atlas had not moved much during the night. He had remained stationed by the fireplace, alert but controlled, like a soldier holding a perimeter. When the first light touched the floor, Ethan sat up slowly. His body felt stiff from the cold stone beneath the sleeping pad. The air inside the cottage held a chill that clung to his lungs. Atlas was already standing, watching the hearth. "All right," Ethan said quietly. "Let's see what you're so concerned about." He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the massive stone structure. In the daylight, it looked less threatening, just old. Thick stones fitted together with care. A slab forming the base, darker from years of fire. But once he crouched, he saw it clearly. A seam, not a crack, a gap. Subtle, but deliberate. The front edge of the hearthstone did not sit flush against the floor like the other stones did. Atlas lowered his nose close to the seam and inhaled deeply. Then he glanced at Ethan. That look. The same look he had given in Syria before pulling him backward from the wired doorway. Ethan placed his fingers against the stone and pushed. Nothing. He shifted his weight and pressed harder against one side. The slab moved. Just slightly. His pulse quickened. "Okay," he murmured. He stood and stepped outside, scanning the clearing for something he could use as leverage. Near the tree line, half buried in weeds, he found an old iron fence post. Rusted, but solid. Back inside, he wedged the narrow end of the post into the seam beneath the slab. "Stand back," he told Atlas. Atlas stepped aside but did not take his eyes off the hearth. Ethan applied steady pressure. The iron bar groaned softly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the stone lifted a fraction of an inch. Dust fell in a thin cloud. Ethan shifted his grip and pushed again. The slab tipped upward slowly, heavy and reluctant, revealing darkness beneath. He leaned the stone carefully against the firebox and aimed the flashlight into the opening. A cavity. Rectangular. Deliberate. Lined with smaller stones to create a hidden chamber roughly 2 feet deep. Atlas stepped forward and inhaled sharply. Inside the chamber lay a rusted metal lockbox, its surface pitted with age. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle. And resting on top of both, folded with careful precision, was an American flag. Old, but preserved. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. He reached into the cavity and lifted the flag first. The fabric felt thick and heavy, stitched in a style he recognized from historical displays. He set it gently on the mantel. Next, he pulled out the lockbox. It was heavier than it looked. The latch was stiff but not locked. He hesitated for a moment before flipping it open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its edges worn but intact. Beneath it were several folded documents secured with twine. Atlas let out a low breath. Ethan picked up the journal and brushed dust from the cover. The leather was cracked with age. On the front, stamped faintly in gold, were initials HD. He opened to the first page. The handwriting inside was precise and controlled. July 3, 1943, Henry Dawson, assigned to monitor suspicious freight movement through Black Hollow Rail Junction. Ethan's eyes scanned faster. Mentions of explosives shipments, unregistered crates, names. He froze. Some of the surnames were familiar. Mercer, Green, Caldwell, families still present in town. Atlas shifted again, sensing the change in Ethan's breathing. Ethan turned another page. December 14th, 1943. Evidence suggests coordinated sabotage. Local cooperation suspected. If this record is found, understand that silence was not surrender. The entries grew more urgent as the pages progressed. March 1st, 1944. Met resistance today. Sheriff aware but unwilling to act. Too many roots tied to too much money. If something happens to me, the mountain will remember. Ethan closed the journal slowly. The cottage felt smaller now. He looked toward the doorway instinctively, as if expecting someone to be standing there. No one was. Just trees and quiet morning air. He examined the folded documents next. Military correspondence. Reports stamped confidential. A recommendation for commendation that had never been processed. Captain Henry Dawson. Recommended for the Silver Star. No record of award. Ethan felt a ripple of anger beneath the surface. Not loud, not explosive, controlled. Atlas moved closer and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's knee, grounding him. Ethan exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a missing man. It was buried truth. He carefully returned the documents to the box and looked back into the chamber. At the bottom, partially hidden in shadow, lay something else. A small cloth pouch. He reached in and retrieved it. Inside were several old service ribbons and a brass insignia pin, tarnished but recognizable. Captain's bars. He sat back on his heels. Someone had hidden this deliberately. Not discarded. Preserved. The realization settled heavily. Sheriff Mercer had known more than he'd said. Clara had hesitated for a reason. The town's silence wasn't superstition. It was protection. Atlas suddenly stiffened. Ears forward. Head turned toward the door. Ethan followed his gaze. A faint crunch of gravel echoed from outside. Not wind. Not animal. Vehicle. Ethan closed the lockbox quickly and lowered the hearthstone back into place, careful to settle it as it had been. Atlas moved to the doorway. The engine outside idled briefly before cutting off. Ethan stood, heart steady but alert. This time, the mountain wasn't just watching. It was testing him. And whatever had been buried beneath that stone had just shifted the balance of everything he thought he had bought it for $1. The engine outside idled for a few seconds longer before cutting off completely. Ethan stood still in the center of the cottage, listening. Atlas was already at the doorway, body low, ears forward, tail stiff but controlled. No bark, just readiness. Ethan stepped beside him and glanced out. A black SUV sat partially concealed by trees near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the sheriff's truck. The windows were tinted dark. The license plate was local. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, dressed in pressed jeans and a fitted jacket too clean for mountain work. His boots barely picked up dust as he walked forward. Logan Mercer. Ethan recognized him from the feed store parking lot earlier that morning, the way other locals had nodded to him with quiet deference. Logan stopped several yards away from the cottage. "Mr. Cole," he called, voice smooth but carrying weight. "Heard you moved in." Ethan didn't step outside fully. "What can I do for you?" Logan's gaze drifted past Ethan into the dim interior, lingering on the hearth. "Just welcoming you to Black Hollow," he said. "This property's been a burden for years. Surprised anyone wanted it. I like challenges." Logan smiled faintly. Some challenges aren't worth finishing. Atlas let out a low, controlled rumble. Logan glanced at the dog. He always that protective? Yes. There was a silence that felt measured. You planning to do renovations? Logan asked. That's the idea. Logan nodded slowly, then took a step back. Well, if you decide this isn't for you, I'd be willing to take it off your hands. Fair price. Save you trouble. Ethan met his eyes evenly. I just got here. Logan's smile didn't change. Mountain has a way of changing minds. He turned and walked back toward the SUV. The vehicle pulled away without another word. Ethan watched until it disappeared down the trail. Atlas remained alert for several seconds before relaxing slightly, but the tension didn't leave the air. Not completely. Night came faster than expected. Clouds rolled in thick from the west, swallowing what little light remained. The wind rose in uneven gusts, rattling tree branches and whistling faintly down the chimney. Ethan secured the door as best he could with a wooden brace he had improvised earlier. He set the lantern low and kept the lockbox hidden beneath his sea bag for now. Atlas returned to the hearth. Waiting. The storm arrived just after midnight. Rain pounded against the slate roof. Thunder rolled deep through the mountains, echoing across valleys like distant artillery. Ethan lay on his pad, eyes open. The journal's words replayed in his mind. If something happens to me, the mountain will remember. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the cottage interior in stark white. For a split second, everything looked exposed. Then darkness again. And beneath the storm's roar, a faint crunch. Gravel. Close. Atlas was on his feet instantly. Ethan rolled to his side, reaching for the flashlight. The crunch came again. Slower. Deliberate. Not wind. Footsteps. Atlas moved toward the door, silent but rigid. Another flash of lightning revealed a shadow crossing the small window. Ethan's pulse sharpened. He stood slowly, positioning himself between Atlas and the center of the room. The door handle rattled. Once. Then again, harder. The wooden brace held. Atlas let out a warning growl now. Deeper, unmistakable. The handle stopped moving. Silence. For 2 full seconds. Then the window on the side wall shattered inward. Glass sprayed across the floor. A dark figure tried to climb through. Atlas launched before Ethan could issue a command. The dog moved like a streak of controlled force. Not reckless, not wild. Direct. A struggle erupted in the narrow space. The intruder stumbled backward through the broken frame, losing balance as Atlas's weight drove into him. Ethan reached the doorway in 3 strides. The storm swallowed sound, but he could see the outline of 2 figures locked in motion against the rain. Atlas! He shouted. The command cut through. Atlas disengaged immediately, retreating to Ethan's side, teeth bared but disciplined. The intruder scrambled backward, clutching his forearm. In the flash of lightning, Ethan saw a glint of metal, a knife. The man turned and ran toward the tree line, disappearing into darkness. Atlas took 1 step forward, but stopped when Ethan placed a hand on his collar. No. The storm raged around them. Ethan's breathing was controlled but heavy. He looked down. Darkness on Atlas's shoulder. Blood. Easy, Ethan murmured, kneeling immediately. The cut wasn't deep but long enough to bleed steadily, likely from the knife during the struggle. Atlas didn't whine, didn't pull away. He stood firm as Ethan examined the wound. I've got you, Ethan said quietly. Inside, Ethan used the small medical kit he always kept in his pack. His hands were steady. Muscle memory from years of field care. Clean. Pressure. Wrap. Atlas held his gaze throughout. Trust unbroken. Outside, the storm began to ease, but something inside Ethan had ignited. The war he had tried to leave behind had found him again. Not through gunfire, through secrecy. Someone had come for what was beneath that hearth. Not to steal randomly, to silence. Ethan sat back against the stone wall once Atlas was bandaged. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance now, farther away. The cottage felt different, not haunted, targeted. Atlas rested his head lightly against Ethan's knee. Ethan stroked his neck slowly. "They don't scare me," he whispered. But the truth was heavier than fear. This wasn't about superstition. This was about history that didn't want to be uncovered, and someone willing to act to keep it buried. The porch light from his childhood had once clicked off without warning. Tonight, someone had tried to break in. Different decades, same lesson. Belonging would not be given. It would be defended. Atlas shifted closer. The storm moved on, and the mountain, once silent, now felt alive with eyes. By dawn, the rain had washed the clearing clean. The air smelled sharp and metallic, like wet stone and pine sap. Mist drifted low across the ground, curling around the base of the cottage as if reluctant to leave. Inside, the lantern burned low. Ethan hadn't slept. Atlas lay on a folded blanket near the hearth, bandaged shoulder rising and falling steadily. The bleeding had stopped. The cut would heal. It would scar. Ethan sat cross-legged beside him, one hand resting lightly on the dog's neck. "You're stubborn," he murmured softly. Atlas opened one eye. "Not stubborn. Faithful." Ethan rose slowly and approached the hearth again. The slab sat exactly where he had placed it the night before, concealing the chamber beneath. The intruder hadn't tried to pry it open, which meant one thing. They didn't know what was under there. Not yet. Ethan knelt and ran his fingers along the stone seam once more. The edges were still dusty from when he had lifted it. He brushed the surface carefully, restoring it to the same dull coat it had worn for decades. Then he moved to the sea bag and pulled out the journal. He returned to the hearth and sat beside Atlas. The morning light crept through the window, illuminating the leather cover in soft gold. He opened it again. July 3rd, 1943. Captain Henry Dawson's handwriting was steady, deliberate, disciplined. The entries carried the tone of a man who believed in duty beyond comfort. Ethan turned to the later pages. February 9th, 1944. Freight manifests falsified. Crates labeled machinery parts rerouted through Black Hollow. Sheriff aware but refuses intervention. Too much influence tied to Mercer family investments. Will proceed independently. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Mercer, not Logan. Older, deeper. March 18th, 1944. Confronted local contact. Threat implied. No official support. If this record survives me, it must serve as testimony. Ethan paused. The words felt personal. He knew what it meant to act without backup, to move forward knowing the system might not catch you if you fell. Atlas shifted, nudging Ethan's hand. "I'm here," Ethan said quietly, unsure if he meant it for the dog or himself. He flipped to the final entry. April 2nd, 1944. If I am silenced, understand this. Betrayal does not erase truth. It delays it. There was no entry after that. No explanation. Just absence. Ethan closed the journal slowly. The cottage felt quieter than it had the night before. Not tense. Weighted. He leaned back against the stone wall and stared into the empty firebox. He imagined Dawson sitting here decades earlier, writing by lantern light, listening to the same wind, hearing the same mountain breathe, alone, trying to hold something larger than himself accountable. Ethan's breathing slowed. He reached into the lockbox again and unfolded the recommendation letter for the Silver Star. The commendation had been drafted but never processed. The signature line was blank, silenced. Not because it wasn't deserved, because it was inconvenient. Ethan's mind flickered briefly to the porch light years ago. Different silence. Same message. You don't matter enough to fight for. He stared into the hearth. Then he did something he hadn't done since arriving. He built a fire. Carefully. Small kindling first. Dry twigs from beneath the eaves, then thicker branches. He struck a match. The flame caught quickly, dancing low against the old soot-stained stones. Atlas lifted his head. The warmth spread slowly through the cottage, pushing back the damp chill. Ethan sat beside the fire, journal resting on his knee. He felt the tremor in his chest begin to settle, not vanish, but soften. PTSD didn't leave quietly. It lingered in shadows, flared in noise, tightened around memory. But in this moment, the crackle of fire was steady, predictable. He read more carefully now, absorbing the details, names of rail supervisors, shipment schedules, coded references to foreign investment partners. This wasn't rumor. It was documentation. Ethan leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the wood burn. For the first time since the intruder, he didn't feel hunted. He felt resolved. There was a knock at the door. Not violent. Measured. Atlas stood, but did not growl. Ethan rose and opened it. Clara Bennett stood outside, holding a small metal tin. "I heard about last night," she said quietly. "Sheriff mentioned broken glass." "Windows busted," Ethan replied evenly. Clara glanced past him at the hearth. "You found something, didn't you?" Ethan held her gaze. She stepped inside without waiting for permission and closed the door behind her. "I've worked in that courthouse long enough to know when history's heavier than paperwork," she said softly. Ethan hesitated. Then he handed her the journal. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she read the first few pages. "My grandfather talked about Dawson," she said after a moment. "Said he was trouble." "Trouble for who?" Ethan asked. Clara didn't answer immediately. "Logan's family owns half the land around here," she said instead. "Been that way for generations. Investments from the war years built most of it." She looked up. "If what's in here is true—" "It is," Ethan said. Clara exhaled slowly. "You're not from here," she said gently. "You don't owe this town anything." Ethan glanced at Atlas, who sat beside the fire, watching them both. "Maybe," Ethan said, "but someone did." Clara closed the journal carefully. "You need to understand something," she said. "People around here don't react well to being exposed. They protect their own." "So do I," Ethan replied quietly. Clara studied him. The scars, the steadiness, the bandaged dog. "You planning to take this public?" "Not yet." Clara nodded slowly. "Good." She turned toward the door. "Whatever you do, don't do it alone." When she left, the cottage felt different again. Not just watched. Connected. Ethan returned to the hearth and sat beside Atlas. The fire burned steady now, casting warm light across the stone walls. He rested his hand on the dog's back. "We finish what he started," he said softly. Atlas leaned into him. Outside, the mountain stood quiet once more. Not threatening, not forgiving, just waiting to see what kind of man would sit at its hearth. The fire burned low as afternoon light stretched thin across the stone floor. Ethan had spent hours rereading Dawson's journal, copying key names into a small notebook of his own. Atlas dozed lightly beside him, though every shift of wind still drew a subtle flick of his ears. By late afternoon, Ethan decided to drive into town. Not to accuse, not yet, just to measure. Black Hollow looked different after the storm. Mud clung to the edges of the road. The diner's neon sign hummed against gray skies. A few locals stood outside the feed store, hats tipped low, conversations quieting briefly as Ethan parked. Atlas stepped out with calm precision, bandage still visible but clean. Eyes followed them, not openly hostile, just cautious. Ethan entered the diner first. The bell above the door jingled softly. The smell of coffee and fried onions filled the air. Sheriff Roy Mercer sat at the counter with a mug in front of him. He did not look surprised. "Morning," Mercer said without turning fully. "Afternoon," Ethan replied. Atlas lay down beside Ethan's stool but kept his head lifted. The waitress poured Ethan coffee without asking. Her hands shook slightly. Mercer took a slow sip from his mug. "Window repair yet?" he asked casually. "Not yet." "You see who it was?" "No." Mercer nodded as if that answer had been expected. "You got something up there worth breaking for?" he asked. Ethan met his gaze. "What would you say if I did?" Mercer's jaw tightened faintly. "I'd say sometimes it's better to let the mountain keep what it's been holding." The diner fell quieter. Forks paused. Conversations lowered. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Captain Henry Dawson," he said calmly. Mercer's mug stopped halfway to his mouth. "Careful," he said under his breath. "I found his journal." The word hung in the air. Journal. Mercer set the mug down slowly. "Some things don't belong to outsiders," he said. "Truth doesn't belong to anyone," Ethan replied evenly. Mercer's eyes sharpened. "You don't understand this town." "Help me," Ethan said. Mercer leaned back in his stool. "My grandfather's name's in that book, isn't it?" Ethan didn't answer. Mercer exhaled slowly. "Henry Dawson came here looking for enemies," he said. "War makes men see threats everywhere. Maybe he was right. Maybe he wasn't. But when he started accusing people with no proof that would hold up in court, families turned against him." "He disappeared," Ethan said. Mercer nodded once. "Bodies get lost in mountains," he said quietly. "Doesn't mean someone pushed him." Ethan felt the tension shift. Not denial, but defense. "What if there was proof?" Ethan asked. Mercer's eyes flicked to Atlas briefly. "Proof of what?" "Sabotage. Falsified freight shipments." Mercer leaned forward now, voice low. "You think digging up 70-year-old accusations is going to fix something? You think Logan Mercer's land holdings vanish because of a wartime ledger?" Logan. There it was, the name placed plainly between them. "I think honor matters," Ethan said quietly. Mercer studied him long and hard. "You a man who believes in clean endings?" he asked. "No," Ethan said, "but I believe in earned ones." Mercer stood slowly. "You're walking into something bigger than you understand," he said. "Logan's grandfather built half this town after the war. Jobs, roads, schools. If Dawson was right, that foundation cracks." "And if he was silenced?" Ethan asked. Mercer didn't respond. He adjusted his hat and stepped past Ethan toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. "You got a good dog," he said. "Keep him close." Then he left. The bell jingled softly behind him. Ethan finished his coffee in silence. When he stepped back outside, Atlas rose immediately and scanned the street. Across the road, Logan Mercer stood near a polished black truck, watching. He crossed slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. "You stirring things already?" Logan asked, tone light, but eyes sharp. "Just asking questions." Logan smiled thinly. "My family's roots here run deep. We've done a lot for Black Hollow." "I'm sure you have." Logan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Men who chase ghosts tend to lose what they've built." Ethan didn't move. "I just started building," he said calmly. Atlas stood now, positioning himself slightly forward. Logan glanced at the bandage. "Storm was rough," he said. "Yes." Logan held Ethan's gaze for a long moment. You can sell me the property. Name your price. Walk away clean. I'm not for sale. Logan's expression hardened for a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned. Mountain changes men, he said. You'll see. He turned and walked back toward his truck. Ethan watched him leave, tension coiling in his chest. Not fear, recognition. This wasn't about superstition. It was about legacy. Power disguised as tradition. Atlas nudged Ethan's hand gently. I know, Ethan murmured. Back at the cottage, the sun dipped low again, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ethan stepped inside and looked at the hearth. The fire was out now, embers cold. He placed the journal back inside the lockbox, but did not return it beneath the stone. Not anymore. He sat on the floor beside Atlas and stared at the wall. The mountain had tested him, the town had warned him, and now the choice was clear. He could sell, disappear, find another patch of quiet ground somewhere else, or he could finish what a man decades ago had been unable to complete. Atlas rested his head against Ethan's thigh. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck. We don't run, he said softly. Outside, dusk settled over the Smokies, and somewhere beyond the tree line, engines moved slowly along gravel roads. Watching. Waiting. The engines faded into the distance, but the feeling lingered long after the sound was gone. Ethan stood in the doorway of the cottage until darkness swallowed the tree line. Atlas remained beside him, shoulder brushing his knee, posture steady despite the bandage across his fur. The choice had been made, not loudly, not with ceremony, just quietly, the way mountains expect. The next morning, Ethan rose before sunrise. He brewed coffee over a small camp stove and laid the journal open on the wooden crate he had begun using as a table. He traced the freight references more carefully this time. Rail junction, secondary depot, unregistered storage site. One entry stood out. March 22nd, 1944. Crates rerouted through abandoned rail warehouse east of Bear Ridge. Marked condemned after flood. Still active after dark. Ethan closed the journal slowly. He knew that building. Or rather, he had driven past the remains of it on his way into Black Hollow, a skeletal brick structure near the old rail line. Roof partially collapsed, surrounded by overgrown weeds. Abandoned. Forgotten. Or so it appeared. He knelt in front of Atlas. You staying close, he said quietly. Atlas's ears flicked forward. The drive to the warehouse took 20 minutes along narrow back roads. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist. The warehouse stood where the trees thinned near a bend in the old rail tracks. Its windows were broken, bricks chipped, roof sagging in places. A faded warning sign still hung crooked near the entrance. Condemned. Ethan parked a short distance away and approached on foot. Atlas moved ahead, nose low, reading scents the way he had once scanned doorways overseas. The ground near the building showed faint tire tracks. Recent. Ethan's pulse sharpened slightly. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Dust motes drifted through shafts of light piercing the broken roof. Metal shelves lined one wall. Most were empty. But near the far corner, something caught Ethan's eye. Old wooden crates. Not new, but not 70 years old either. He crouched beside one and ran his hand across the faded lettering. Machinery parts. The same labeling Dawson had described. Atlas stiffened suddenly. Head up, listening. Ethan turned slowly. Footsteps echoed faintly from the opposite side of the warehouse. More than one. He moved quickly, but quietly, guiding Atlas behind a stack of collapsed pallets. Two men entered through the side door. Neither wore uniforms. Both carried flashlights despite the daylight filtering through. One of them spoke in a low voice. Logan said, check it again. Nothing's here, the other replied. Just old junk. They moved closer to the crates. Ethan felt the old rhythm return. Not panic, not fear. Focus. Atlas waited for instruction. The men began prying open one of the boxes with a crowbar. Inside lay nothing but scrap metal. "See?" one muttered. "Boss doesn't want loose ends." Loose ends. Ethan's jaw tightened. The men began stacking the crates into a loose pile. Then one of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a small red can. Gasoline. Ethan's heartbeat slowed deliberately, controlled. Atlas's muscles tensed. Ethan leaned down and whispered one word. "Ready." The first splash of fuel hit the crate stack. The sharp smell filled the air instantly. The man struck a lighter. Ethan moved. Fast. He stepped from behind the pallets, voice firm and commanding. "That's enough." The men spun around, startled. Atlas launched forward at Ethan's silent signal, not attacking wildly, but closing distance fast and controlled, forcing separation. One man stumbled backward, dropping the lighter. The other swung the crowbar reflexively. Ethan deflected the movement and drove him backward without escalating further. The gasoline can tipped, spilling more fuel across the floor. The lighter hit the ground. A small flame flickered. Atlas barked sharply. Ethan grabbed the fallen can and kicked it away from the spreading fuel, but the flame caught along the soaked wood. Fire climbed quickly across the crate stack. The men scrambled toward the exit. "Get out!" Ethan shouted. Smoke began to thicken. Atlas hesitated, eyes flicking between Ethan and the rising flames. "Out!" Ethan commanded again. The dog obeyed instantly. Ethan followed, coughing as heat surged upward behind him. Outside, the fire began to consume the interior of the warehouse, smoke billowing into the sky. The two men ran toward a truck parked near the trees. Ethan did not pursue. His focus shifted immediately. "Atlas!" The dog emerged from the smoke a few seconds later, but his steps were slower. He stumbled slightly. Smoke inhalation. Ethan dropped to his knees and pulled Atlas close, checking his breathing. "Stay with me," he murmured. Atlas blinked, but remained conscious. Ethan lifted him carefully and carried him toward the truck. The warehouse behind them crackled as flames climbed higher. By the time sirens wailed faintly in the distance, the roof had begun to collapse inward. Ethan sat in the driver's seat with Atlas's head resting in his lap, windows open, cool air flowing through. "You saved me again," he said quietly. Atlas's eyes remained half open, breathing steady but labored. The fire consumed what little evidence remained inside. But Ethan had seen enough. The crates weren't random. They were being destroyed deliberately. Someone was erasing the past. Sheriff Mercer's cruiser arrived first. He stepped out slowly, watching the blaze. Ethan met his gaze. "That building's been abandoned for decades," Mercer said. "Not recently," Ethan replied. Mercer's eyes flicked to Atlas. "Your dog all right?" "He will be." Mercer looked back at the fire. "You're pushing," he said quietly. "I'm finishing," Ethan replied. The fire roared behind them. The mountain did not look away, and as smoke curled into the afternoon sky, Ethan understood something clearly for the first time since he'd bought the cottage. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about money. It was about silence being protected by fear. Atlas shifted slightly in his lap, recovering strength. Ethan placed a hand gently on the dog's chest. "We're not done," he said softly. And neither was the mountain. The fire burned long into the evening. By the time the flames died down to smoldering beams and glowing ash, the old warehouse was nothing more than a blackened shell against the fading light. Ethan sat in his truck, with Atlas resting across the passenger seat, breathing steadier now. The vet in the next county had checked him quickly. Mild smoke inhalation. Nothing permanent. Rest. Fluids. Quiet. Quiet. That word felt almost ironic. The drive back to the cottage was silent. The Smoky Mountains rose dark and patient on either side of the narrow road. The world looked unchanged, but something had shifted. Someone had tried to erase evidence. Someone had tried to burn history into smoke, and Atlas had nearly paid the price. When Ethan carried him inside the cottage, the air felt different, more fragile, as if even the stone walls were listening. He laid Atlas down near the hearth and knelt beside him. "You stay," he said gently. Atlas's tail moved once, faint but loyal. Ethan rose and walked to the table. The journal lay open where he had left it earlier. The pages fluttered slightly in the evening breeze through the broken window. He picked it up. He could still walk away. Sell the property. Disappear. No one would blame him. He was not from Black Hollow. He owed nothing to its history, nothing to its silence. But that wasn't true. He owed something to a man who had written those final words by firelight. "If I am silenced, understand this. Betrayal does not erase truth. It delays it." Ethan exhaled slowly. He reached into his duffel and pulled out a small laptop. He hadn't used it much since arriving. Screens and news feeds often made the noise in his mind louder. But tonight, it was necessary. He connected to a weak signal hotspot and began searching. Military archives. World War II commendation records. Captain Henry Dawson. The name existed. But the record ended abruptly in April 1944. No medal awarded. Status: missing. Ethan leaned back, jaw tight. He opened a new email and began drafting a message to a contact he hadn't spoken to in years. A historian attached to the Naval War College who specialized in suppressed wartime records. Subject line: Inquiry. Regarding Captain Henry Dawson, 1944 Black Hollow assignment. He attached photos he had taken of the journal pages and the unfinished Silver Star recommendation. His fingers hovered above the keyboard for a moment. Sending this meant escalation. No more quiet investigation. No more local conversation. It meant pulling light toward the mountain. He hit send. The screen went dark. Atlas shifted and let out a soft breath. Ethan knelt beside him again, resting his hand gently on the dog's chest. "You didn't go through fire for nothing," he murmured. Morning came cold and clear. A knock sounded at the door. Not hesitant. Not threatening. Measured. Ethan opened it to find Sheriff Mercer standing alone, hat in hand. "I saw the fire reports," Mercer said. "Warehouse is gone." "So I noticed." Mercer's eyes drifted briefly to Atlas. "He saved you," he said quietly. "Yes." Mercer stepped inside without waiting for invitation this time. He removed his hat and turned it in his hands. "You sent something," he said. Ethan didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I did." "To who?" "People who can read records without fear." Mercer closed his eyes briefly. "You understand what that does?" "It tells the truth." Mercer shook his head slowly. "It tells outsiders that this town was built on rot." "Was it?" Ethan asked. The question hung between them. Mercer walked to the hearth and stared at the stone slab. "My grandfather wasn't a monster," he said quietly. "He was a man trying to keep his family fed. The war brought money through here. Investors, contracts. He chose stability over suspicion." "And Dawson?" Ethan asked. Mercer swallowed. "Dawson chose confrontation." "And disappeared," Ethan said evenly. Mercer's voice softened. "You think bringing this back gives peace?" "No," Ethan replied. "But it gives honor." Silence filled the cottage. Atlas lifted his head slightly, watching the exchange. Mercer finally spoke again. "Logan won't stop," he said. "He's already angry." "Anger isn't authority," Ethan said. Mercer met his eyes. "You could have sold," he said quietly. "I'm not for sale." Mercer nodded slowly. You sound like Dawson. Maybe that's the point. The sheriff stepped toward the door, but paused before leaving. If federal attention comes, he said, Black Hollow will change. Maybe it should, Ethan replied. After Mercer left, the waiting began. 3 days passed. Atlas recovered strength quickly, though the scar on his shoulder remained visible, a pale reminder against dark fur. Ethan repaired the broken window and reinforced the door. Each evening, he built a fire, not out of fear, out of intention. On the 4th day, his laptop chimed, an email response. He opened it slowly. The historian's reply was concise but unmistakable. Captain Henry Dawson's Silver Star recommendation located in archival microfilm. Filed but never processed due to missing final approval signature. Supplemental documents suggest internal suppression pending local investigation. This warrants formal review. Ethan exhaled slowly. He read the final line twice. If supporting evidence exists, submission to Department of Defense Historical Review Board is appropriate. It wasn't justice yet, but it was acknowledgement. He looked at Atlas. We don't burn, he said softly. We document. Outside, a black truck slowed briefly on the road before continuing on. Logan Mercer was feeling the shift, and the mountain, once silent, was beginning to echo. Ethan closed the laptop and walked to the hearth. He placed the journal carefully inside the lockbox again. Not to hide it, but to preserve it until the right moment. The choice had been made. Not with a shout, not with a weapon, but with a record. Truth, sent beyond the reach of one town's fear. And this time, it would not disappear quietly. The waiting lasted 6 weeks. In the mountains, time didn't move in straight lines. It moved in weather shifts and leaf changes. Mist gave way to crisp blue mornings. The air turned sharper. The first hints of autumn brushed the treetops in faded gold. Ethan worked during the days. He repaired sections of the stone cottage roof, replaced cracked boards on the porch, reinforced the window frame with salvaged timber. Each nail driven felt deliberate, steady, proof that something solid was being built, not just uncovered. Atlas followed him everywhere. The scar on his shoulder had healed into a pale line beneath dark fur. It didn't slow him. If anything, it seemed to sharpen his awareness. He patrolled the clearing at dusk, nose high, watching the tree line the way he once watched rooftops overseas. Logan Mercer's truck had not returned. But tension lingered in town. Conversations quieted when Ethan entered a room. The diner waitress no longer trembled, but she avoided eye contact. Sheriff Mercer maintained distance, nodding once in passing but saying little. Then, on a clear Monday morning, a white government sedan rolled into Black Hollow. It didn't stop at the diner. It didn't stop at the courthouse. It drove straight toward the Smoky Mountain Ridge Road. Ethan saw the vehicle approach from the porch. Atlas stood immediately, posture alert but not aggressive. 2 men stepped out of the sedan. Both wore dark suits, neither flashy nor intimidating, just official. One carried a thin leather briefcase. Mr. Ethan Cole? The taller one asked. Yes. We're with the Department of Defense Historical Review Board. The words landed with quiet gravity. Ethan stepped aside, inviting them in. They removed their jackets and stood near the hearth, studying the stone structure almost unconsciously. You submitted documentation regarding Captain Henry Dawson, the older man said. I did. Additional microfilm records confirm the Silver Star recommendation was suspended pending internal review. That review was never concluded. Ethan handed them the journal. The room fell silent except for the turning of pages. Atlas remained seated near the door, eyes tracking every subtle shift. After several minutes, the younger official looked up. This is authentic, he said quietly. Yes. The older man closed the journal carefully. Mr. Cole, suppression of commendations during wartime investigations is not unprecedented, he said. However, The circumstances described here warrant correction. Correction? Ethan asked. A formal reinstatement of the commendation, the man replied. Pending final verification, of course. But I believe this town owes Captain Dawson acknowledgement. The phrase echoed. This town owes. Ethan nodded slowly. When? He asked. As soon as paperwork is processed, we would recommend a public ceremony, official recognition. Public. There would be no quiet resolution, no private archive filing. The truth would step into daylight. News traveled faster than the mountain wind. By the end of the week, Black Hollow knew. Some residents reacted with cautious curiosity, others with visible discomfort. Logan Mercer remained unseen, though whispers said he was handling it. Sheriff Mercer approached Ethan 2 days before the scheduled ceremony. They stood outside the courthouse, facing the Smoky Ridge line. My grandfather signed freight permits, Mercer said quietly. He wasn't the mastermind, but he knew enough to question. Did he? Ethan asked. Mercer hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. But I know silence built things here, and now it's cracking. Ethan looked at the town square. That doesn't mean it collapses, he said. It means it stands differently. The ceremony took place in front of the restored stone cottage. The government officials insisted on it. The hearth that had once hidden the journal now stood as backdrop. Folding chairs lined the clearing. A modest crowd gathered, town residents, local press, a few veterans from neighboring counties. Clara Bennett stood near the front. Sheriff Mercer stood off to the side, hat removed. Logan Mercer arrived late, remaining at the back, arms crossed. The Department of Defense representative stepped forward. Today, he began, we correct a record delayed by fear and circumstance. Captain Henry Dawson served his country honorably. His investigation into wartime sabotage demonstrated courage beyond battlefield action. The Silver Star Medal rested on a velvet cushion. A descendant of Captain Dawson, located through federal records, had traveled from Ohio to attend. A gray-haired man with steady eyes stepped forward. The medal was presented. Applause followed. Not thunderous, but sincere. Sheriff Mercer stepped forward next. For generations, he said, voice steady but quiet, this town chose comfort over confrontation. That choice ends today. He turned toward Ethan. Mr. Cole didn't come here to fight us, he continued. He came here to finish something left undone. Atlas lay beside Ethan's boots, calm and watchful. The crowd shifted. The mountain wind moved gently through the trees. When the ceremony concluded, people lingered longer than expected. Some approached Ethan quietly, offering brief thanks. A few veterans shook his hand firmly, nodding in understanding. Logan Mercer did not approach. He left without a word. As the sun dipped lower, casting warm light across the clearing, Ethan stood alone beside the hearth. Atlas pressed against his leg. You did it, Clara said softly behind him. No, Ethan replied. He did. Clara smiled faintly. You stayed, she said. That word meant more than she realized. Stayed. Ethan looked at the cottage, the stone walls no longer feeling haunted, not erased, not forgotten. Recognized. Atlas rested his head lightly against Ethan's knee. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, Ethan did not feel like an outsider guarding borrowed ground. He felt like a steward, not of land, but of truth. And the mountain, once silent, now stood in open daylight, no longer hiding what it had held. Winter arrived gently in the Smokies, not with violence but with stillness. The first snow came overnight, laying a quiet blanket across the ridges and settling into the grooves of the old stone cottage. The world softened under white. Sound carried differently, muted, patient. Ethan rose before dawn. The fire in the hearth had burned low to glowing embers. Atlas lay stretched near the warmth, breathing deep and even, scar faintly visible against his shoulder. Ethan added a fresh log and watched the flame take hold. The hearth no longer felt like a vault. It felt like a center. Weeks had passed since the ceremony. The Department of Defense had issued a formal corrections to Captain Dawson's record. Local news outlets had carried the story briefly. A small plaque now stood beside the cottage door, acknowledging Dawson's service and the restoration of his honor. Sheriff Mercer had stopped by twice, not as an adversary, but as a neighbor. Once with fresh venison, once with quiet apology. Clara had begun organizing a local history archive at the courthouse. To make sure we don't bury things again, she had said. Logan Mercer had remained distant. Not gone, but changed. The town itself felt different, less guarded, more reflective. Ethan stepped outside onto the porch. Snow crunched softly under his boots. The clearing glowed pale beneath the early light. Smoke drifted from the chimney, rising straight into the cold sky. Atlas joined him moments later, sitting beside him without command. They stood that way for a long time. Ethan's mind wandered, not to war, not to fire or broken windows, but to a porch years ago in another town. A duffel bag, a locked door, a note. The memory still carried weight, but it no longer carried heat. He had spent years believing belonging was something granted by others. A key handed over. A door opened. But here, in the quiet mountain air, he understood something different. Belonging could be built, board by board, stone by stone, choice by choice. Atlas nudged his hand gently. Ethan knelt and wrapped an arm around the dog's neck. "You did more than guard me," he murmured. Atlas leaned into him, steady as ever. There had been 2 rescues in his life that mattered most. One in Syria, when Atlas had dragged him from a burning compound, and one in Tennessee, when the dog had refused to let fear drive him away from the hearth. The PTSD had not vanished. Nightmares still came sometimes, less sharp now, but present. Loud noises still made his muscles tighten before his mind caught up. But the mountains had given him something the battlefield never could. Space to breathe. Space to choose. Inside, a letter rested on the wooden table. He had written it slowly over several evenings. To his mother. He had not blamed her for the locked door. Not entirely. Silence, like in Black Hollow, often came from fear rather than cruelty. He told her about the cottage, about the mountain, about Captain Dawson, about Atlas. He did not ask for apology. He did not demand explanation. He simply wrote, "I built something. It's small, but it's mine." The fire cracked softly behind him as he stepped back inside. He placed another log on the hearth and watched sparks rise. Atlas lay down at his boots. The cottage no longer felt like a project. It felt like a home, not because it was perfect, but because it had been chosen. The mountain wind moved gently across the roof, no longer sounding like warning. Just weather. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on Atlas's back. The scar beneath his palm was a reminder of danger faced, of loyalty proven, of silence broken. Outside, the Smoky Mountains stretched endlessly under winter light, ridges layered in silver and shadow. Inside, the hearth burned steady. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and let the warmth settle into his chest. He did not need to be anywhere else. He did not need to prove anything further. Some doors closed to push you toward the place that was waiting all along. And this time, no one could lock him out. If you believe a man should stand his ground and defend what's right, type yes in the comments. And if you've ever had to fight quietly for your dignity, drop a 1. We read every single one. Subscribe if you believe in justice, loyalty, and stories where ordinary Americans refuse to back down. There's more coming from these mountains.